Sarah Delano Roosevelt is remembered as the adoring mother behind Franklin Roosevelt, the serene Hudson Valley widow whose perfect Victorian marriage produced a president. Here is what that marriage actually was. A 52-year-old widower who had already proposed to another woman, accepting a 26-year-old bride the same age as his son. Her father negotiated the terms like a merger, because it was one. Decades later, Sarah used the same playbook on her son, holding his marriage together with money after he betrayed his wife. Then the woman she controlled outlived her and took the story. It started with a rejection. According to a recollection preserved in the Roosevelt family and reported by biographer Jeffrey Ward, James Roosevelt of Hyde Park, a widower for 4 years, gray side whiskers, a Hudson River estate, and a grown son, proposed marriage to Anna Roosevelt called Bamie, the older sister of Theodore Roosevelt. She was roughly half his age. She turned him down. The story comes from family memory rather than any surviving letter, so treat it with appropriate caution. But what happened next is not in dispute. In the spring of 1880, at a dinner given by Mrs. Theodore Roosevelt Sr. at the family's home in Manhattan, James was seated near a tall, dark-haired guest of 26 named Sarah Delano. Within a week, he had invited her family up to Springwood, his estate at Hyde Park. During that visit, he asked Sarah to arrange the flowers for his table, a small domestic audition, and both of them apparently understood it as one. He was 52. His son from his first marriage, James Roosevelt, known as Rosie, had been born in 1854. So had Sarah. Why a striking, wealthy young woman would accept a man old enough to be her father is the question the doting grandmother photographs were designed to keep anyone from asking. The answer starts with her own father. Warren Delano II built one of the great American fortunes of his century in the China trade, and he was blunt about what that trade included. Opium moved through the firm he served, and when the Panic of 1857 wiped him out, he went back to China in his 50s and rebuilt the fortune the same way, shipping opium during the Civil War years. He raised his 11 children at Algonac, a dark, handsome estate above the Hudson at Newburgh, and he ran the family the way he ran his ledgers. When Sarah was 8, the whole household sailed to Hong Kong to join him. She spent part of her girlhood inside a trading compound on the far side of the world, absorbing the family's operating principle. That name, discipline, and capital were the real architecture of life, and sentiment was decoration. She also picked up a habit she never dropped. She kept a diary nearly every day for the rest of her life. Remember that. Warren Delano vetted his daughter's suitors like investment proposals, and he rejected the interesting ones. A young architect named Stanford White, later the most famous designer in America, courted Sarah and got nowhere with her father, who reportedly dismissed him as the red-headed trial. By 1880, Sarah was 26, which in her world meant the window was closing. Then came James Roosevelt, and Warren Delano, a fierce Republican, delivered the line the family repeated for generations. James was the first person who has made me realize that a Democrat can be a gentleman. That was the approval. Look at what each side was actually buying. James had lost his first wife, Rebecca Howland, in 1876, and Springwood needed a mistress, someone to run the house, preside at his table, and ideally give him another child. Sarah got escape from her father's roof, the rank of an established river family, and an estate of her own to command, trading one older man's authority for another's on terms she could live with. She brought Delano money with her. Her share of the fortune eventually amounted to roughly $1 million. An enormous sum then. 2 Hudson Valley houses were consolidating assets. The courtship took months, and by all accounts it was courteous, calm, and completely unsurprising to anyone who understood what it was. The wedding, on October 7, 1880, took place at Algonac. Not at the groom's estate, not at a fashionable Manhattan church, at the bride's father's house, on the bride's father's ground, which tells you whose signature mattered on this contract. The ceremony itself was restrained. The honeymoon was not. James took his young wife to Europe for 10 months. England, the continent, a slow procession through relatives and resorts, the kind of tour that functions less as romance than as an announcement. And consider the family Sarah was marrying into. Her new stepson Rosie, again, her exact contemporary, had married an Astor, bringing that fortune into the orbit too. Nobody in this story married randomly. The household Sarah entered was less a family than a portfolio, and everyone in it knew their holdings. Springwood itself came with fixed terms. James Roosevelt lived as a country squire on a schedule that predated his new wife and did not adjust for her. His cattle, his ice boats on the frozen Hudson, his duties as vestryman at the local Episcopal church, his deliberate distance from the flashy Vanderbilt's building palaces nearby. Sarah moved into a house that had been furnished and run by the first Mrs. Roosevelt, and the surviving record suggests she referred to her husband, in the early years, as Mr. Roosevelt. That detail gets softened in the retellings into period charm. Read it plainly instead. A 26-year-old addressing her husband the way she'd address her father's business partner. What developed between them appears to have been genuine companionship. She admired him. He was attentive and kind, but it operated entirely on his generation's terms. He decided, she managed. The neighbors saw the perfect gentry marriage, and in the sense that mattered to both families, it was performing exactly as specified. Then came January 30th, 1882, and the event that quietly ended the marriage as a marriage. Sarah's labor lasted more than a day. The doctor administered chloroform and gave her too much. The baby, over 10 pounds, arrived blue and limp, not breathing, and had to be revived by the doctor's own mouth-to-mouth efforts. Mother and child both nearly died in that bedroom at Springwood, and according to the family record, the doctors advised that Sarah should not risk another pregnancy. She was 27 years old. Whatever physical dimension the marriage had, the medical verdict effectively closed it. And Sarah did what a Delano does with a concentrated position. She committed everything to it. She nursed Franklin herself for nearly a year, almost unheard of for women of her class, who handed infants to wet nurses. She recorded his weight, his words, his days in the diary. The serene family portraits from these years show a handsome older gentleman, a poised young wife, a golden child. What they actually document is a household reorganizing itself around a single asset, because there would never be another. The reorganization deepened as James's health failed. Around 1890, when Franklin was 8, his father's heart began to give out. And for the next decade, Sarah's marriage became a nursing assignment. Seasons at the German spa of Bad Nauheim. Careful management of an invalid's routines. A wife in her 30s running a slow-motion death watch. Her real emotional life ran through the boy. She kept Franklin in dresses and long curls past the age when other mothers relented, schooled him at home with tutors, and held him out of Groton until he was 14, 2 years behind his classmates, who had formed their friendships without him. Her diary entry from the day she left him at the school admits how hard she and James found the parting. Franklin, dropped into a cohort that had no place for him, learned to survive by charm and by concealment, cheerful letters home, difficulties edited out. His mother told exactly what would please her. Historians who study the man's famous opacity, his lifelong habit of agreeing warmly with everyone while committing to no one, generally trace it to this apprenticeship. He learned to manage people by managing Sarah. James Roosevelt died on December 8, 1900. His will left Springwood in Sarah's control, and the trust that came to 18-year-old Franklin threw off only a modest income, around $5,000 or $6,000 a year. Real money, but not independence. The real fortune sat with his mother, and it would sit there for the next 41 years. Here is the moment to watch. Sarah was 46, wealthy, handsome, and free in a way almost no woman of her era ever got to be. She could have remarried, traveled, built any life she wanted. Instead, she rented an apartment in Boston so she could spend winters near Franklin at Harvard, and she was entirely unembarrassed about the reason. The widow did not rebuild her life. She relocated it onto her son, which is why what he did next hit her the way it did. For over a year, Franklin secretly courted his distant cousin Eleanor Roosevelt, the shy, orphaned niece of the sitting president, and told his mother nothing until the engagement was already decided. At Thanksgiving, 1903. His letter to Sarah afterward survives, and it concedes the crime in its opening breath. He knew, he wrote, "What pain I must have caused you." Sarah's counteroffensive was polite, sustained, and documented in the family correspondence. She extracted a promise that the engagement stay secret for a year. In February 1904, she took Franklin and his college roommate on a Caribbean cruise, transparently hoping distance would do its work. She even explored getting Franklin posted to London with the American ambassador, who declined to cooperate. None of it worked, and on March 17, 1905, the wedding went forward in Manhattan, on a date chosen because Theodore Roosevelt, President of the United States, would be in the city for the St. Patrick's Day parade and could give his niece away. He did, delivering his famous line to the groom, "There's nothing like keeping the name in the family." Then the entire party followed the president into the next room to hear him talk, leaving the bride and groom standing more or less alone at their own reception. Even their wedding belonged to somebody else. It set the tone with brutal accuracy. Having lost the battle over the marriage, Sarah annexed it. Her Christmas gift in 1905 was the announcement of a townhouse, which became, by 1908, 2 townhouses at 47 and 49 East 65th Street, built as a single connected structure. Sarah commissioned them, Sarah paid for them, Sarah approved the plans. One side for her, one side for Franklin and Eleanor, with doors connecting the 2 homes at multiple levels, so that the boundary between the households was, by design, a formality. A few weeks after moving in, Franklin found Eleanor in tears at her dressing table. She told him, and she recorded this herself, decades later in her memoir, that she did not like living in a house that was not in any way hers, that reflected nothing she had done or chosen. He told her she would feel differently soon, and left the room, genuinely baffled. He had spent his whole life inside his mother's arrangements. He could not see the walls anymore. Sarah paid for the servants, the doctors, the children's schools, and much of daily life. And money delivered on schedule is also control delivered on schedule. Later family recollections, offered years afterward, so weigh them accordingly, have Sarah telling her grandchildren that their mother had merely borne them, and that she was their real mother. Whether or not those exact words were spoken, the household arithmetic said the same thing daily. Then, in September 1918, the arrangement met its one true crisis. Franklin, by now Assistant Secretary of the Navy, came home from wartime Europe seriously ill, and Eleanor, unpacking his luggage, found a bundle of letters. They were from Lucy Mercer, her own social secretary. The woman Eleanor had hired in 1914 and welcomed into her house had been carrying on an affair with her husband inside the family's own social world, which made the humiliation total in a way an anonymous mistress never could. Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce. What stopped him is where this story doubles back on itself. According to accounts that surfaced later within the Roosevelt family, there is no contemporary document, and honest historians flag that. Sarah delivered an ultimatum. If Franklin abandoned his wife and 5 children, she would cut him off. Not another dollar, and Springwood's future thrown into doubt. Lewis Howe, Franklin's political advisor, supplied the secular version of the same sentence. A divorced man was finished in American politics, and Lucy Mercer, a Catholic, would by family accounts never have married a divorced father of 5 anyway. Every exit was walled. Franklin stayed, promising never to see Lucy again. A promise he eventually broke, since Lucy Mercer was with him at Warm Springs the day he died in 1945. But that lay decades ahead. The marriage that survived 1918 was not the one that entered it. Eleanor later told her biographer Joseph Lash that the bottom dropped out of her world that autumn. What she and Franklin rebuilt was a working partnership, formidable, loyal in its way, and no longer intimate. Notice what Sarah's money had now done twice. It had constructed her own marriage in 1880. In 1918, it enforced her son's. The devoted grandmother of the newsreels was, functionally, the holding company that kept the Roosevelt marriage from being dissolved. In August 1921, at Campobello, polio took Franklin's legs, and Sarah arrived home from Europe with a complete plan already formed. Her son would retire to Hyde Park and live out his years as an invalid country squire, tended and managed, the precise life she had run once before, for his father. She was offering her son the only marriage she had ever had. Eleanor and Lewis Howe fought her openly, insisting Franklin stay in politics, and this battle, the first declared war between the 2 women, is documented in Eleanor's own memoirs. Eleanor won it. Sarah lost the argument and kept the treasury. Her checks sustained the household through the wilderness years, and when Franklin sank roughly 2/3 of his personal fortune into the polio resort at Warm Springs in 1926, over her objections, her money became more indispensable, not less. One boundary never moved. Springwood was Sarah's. Under his father's will, it remained hers for life, which means Franklin Roosevelt never owned his own home until he was 59 years old. In these same years, Eleanor got something she had never had. Franklin built her a cottage at Valkill, 2 miles from the big house. The woman who once wept over living in a house that was not hers finally acquired her own walls, and from inside them she began building a public career, a press following, and a network that owed nothing to her mother-in-law. File that away. By the White House years, Sarah had become a national institution, and she worked the role like a professional. In 1933, the inauguration year, she published a memoir, My Boy Franklin, produced with 2 collaborators, in which she insisted she had never been a managing mother and had never tried to shape her son's life. A claim contradicted by roughly everything you've just heard. At Springwood, which served as the summer White House, the seating told the truth the memoir wouldn't. Sarah presided at the table across from the President of the United States, with the First Lady placed along the side. When the King and Queen of England came to Hyde Park in 1939, they came, formally, to Sarah's house. The doting mother myth wasn't a distortion imposed on her. It was her own manufacture, her book, her hostess's chair, the photographs she granted, and it worked because the country wanted a grandmother, and she supplied one. Sarah died at Springwood on September 7, 1941, with Franklin at her side. He had come home when told she was failing. The household story, repeated by staff and family for years, is that minutes after her death, the largest oak on the estate came down, with no storm anywhere. Franklin wore a black armband for a full year, and characteristically said almost nothing. Eleanor said something, privately, that survives in a letter to her daughter Anna. She was appalled at herself, she confessed, because she could not feel any real grief after so many years of close association, and that seemed terrible to her. 36 years in the connected houses had left exactly that much warmth. And then came the part Sarah never planned for. She had controlled the marriage, the money, the houses, and the myth, but Eleanor controlled the future, because Eleanor outlived her by 21 years, and Eleanor published. This Is My Story had already appeared in 1937. This I Remember followed in 1949, and in its pages the national grandmother became, permanently, the domineering mother-in-law. The woman about whom Eleanor wrote that Franklin's children were more my mother-in-law's children than they were mine. That is the Sarah Roosevelt history kept. Every biography, every film, every retelling runs through Eleanor's account, written by the shy bride who once cried at a dressing table in a house that wasn't hers. Meanwhile, Sarah's own version, the diaries she kept nearly every day from girlhood, 7 decades of them, sits in the Franklin D. Roosevelt Library at Hyde Park, archived, preserved, and mostly unread. Look at the famous image one more time. The silver-haired matriarch beside her son, the president, the devoted mother of the perfect American family. Now you know what it was, the final product of a merger signed at Algonac in 1880, between a rejected widower of 52 and a second-choice bride whose father approved the terms, sustained across 2 generations by money deployed as a leash, including the money that forced a betrayed wife and an unfaithful husband to stay married for the sake of a career that hadn't happened yet. Sarah built all of it and documented all of it, 1 diary page at a time for 70 years. She still lost the story to the daughter-in-law she outbid, outspent, and overruled, who simply waited, and then wrote the marriage America believes in to this day.